Dr. Derugy received her master's in economics from the University of Paris, number 9, Dauphine, and her PhD in economics from Université de Paris, Sorbonne. She previously directed academic programs for the Institute for Humane Studies, Europe, in France. And without further ado, I'll turn the program over to our first speaker, Dr. Véronique Derugy. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Jim. Well, you make me sound really old, which I'm not. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the very much talked about but strangely overlooked problem with the budget process and the possible reforms. I mean, the budget process is broken, right? We hear it all the time, right? How many of you have heard this in the last 2 weeks, right? Month? Yes, pretty much everyone. We hear it all the time. But the truth is, and especially seriously in the light of the last few years, I mean, it certainly feels this way, but the truth is that it has never reliably actually worked and control spending. Since its creation in 1947 with the Congressional Budget and Impoundments Act, we can say that the budget process has arguably helped or had been biased toward more spending. And as the year went by, it actually became weaker and weaker as lawmakers learned to exploit its structural flaws. Do I have a clicker, by the way? Yeah. I don't know how that works. So, which one? What's that? This year is a painfully good example of just what's wrong with our budget. As you can see on this slide, it's been 890 some days since Congress passed a budget resolution. This year is the first year ever in the history of this country that the Senate has not even written a budget, right? But it's not just the problem with the Democrats. Under the Bush years, we've had many years where actually the House passed the budget, the Senate passed the budget, but then they could not agree in conference. And then we had these massive omnibus bill, which really are bad for taxpayers because they increase spending massively. So with so much undecided and up in the air, what you end up having is that the winners of this mess are not the taxpayers, but they are actually the people who actually understand the complexity and of the budget process and can actually, again, exploit the gimmicks and the loopholes in the system. And that's really not good for any of us. In a nutshell, the budget process should be about setting priorities. We only have so much money that we can use. And a rational budget process should actually, do this. Set priorities based on how much money we have and allocate this money appropriately. It doesn't do any of this. So what I want to talk to you today is the problems. I mean, I'm only going to list 4 problems with the current budget process and then explain why it is so hard, in my opinion, to actually get, to get it right. Before I pass it on to David, who actually is going to give you a brilliant example of the great things we can do to get it right. So, 4 problems. The first one is that the president and Congress have no incentives to actually get it right and get it done. When you think about it, the president, issues a budget, and Congress is absolutely, allowed to put it in the trash and proceed with their own budget. And that's well and fine, right? But the problem is that Congress itself has no incentive in actually just getting it right and even passing a budget, as we've seen. I mean, they totally ignore their own rules very often without any problem. And what we end up having in the end is in the fall, most of the things that happens is like we have 2 things that can happen. It's like, one, they either really hastily are gonna get to an agreement without taking the time, because it's the first time they actually get together to talk about priorities, to hastily get together, get it done, get an agreement, ignoring all priorities and all things that matters, and basically that increases spending, or they actually vaguely take the time, and then we end up in a situation like we've been, and of course they find out right there that they can't agree on anything, whether it's Congress among itself or Congress and the president, and we end up in a situation where, we're in a position where some programs risk to be not getting enough money. So that's a problem, but it's the least of our problem. The second problem we have is the fact that the budget process doesn't serve as a clearinghouse for all spending, and that's a gigantic problem. As you know, only a third, roughly, of actually the spending that the federal government commits to spending go through the budget process. In particular, the mandatory side of the budget, all these autopilot programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are off the table, and they don't really go through the budget process. As you can see on this chart, going forward, it's going to be an even bigger problem than it's been in the past. As you can see on this chart, right, the real explosion in spending is coming from programs like Medicare, Medicaid. And whether you're in favor of these programs and want to save them or not, having them off the table is certainly not a way to guarantee their survival. So it's a big problem. Mandatory spending, so most of the spending doesn't go through the budget process, is off the table. The other big problem is that things like emergency spending, which in the last 10 years have actually turned out to be a gigantic share, or a bigger share of how much the federal government spends, is off the table too. So when, especially in the last 10 years, after Congress conveniently let the final budget rules expire, that was actually kind of, controlling somewhat the emergency spending process, when in the last 10 years, when inevitably some $100 billion was going through the emergency process, this had not gone through. This had not gone through the budget process. And when it had, because it had this special, tag, emergency, it wasn't actually submitted to the same scrutiny as the rest of the spending. So these are it's really, I see it as a really massive problem with our budget process. Like 2/3 of the spending, is off the table. That's certainly not a way to set priorities. We don't do this. At least I don't do this. I hope you don't either do this with my budget. The third problem is that this is, as I said, the budget process is highly biased towards higher saving and higher taxes too. So there's 3 reasons for this. The first one, which I think is extremely critical, is the fact that there's nowhere in the budget process where the question about how big the federal government spending should be, what the size of the government should be, is actually answered and settled. There's nothing like that. So you have things like PAYGO, for instance, that offsets new spending, which is really minor, compared to all the spending that's already been decided, but that doesn't settle that question. You have some spending caps, but again, because it doesn't apply to, that actually settled the growth of spending to some extent, but because also it doesn't apply to the entire spending, it just doesn't settle that question. So that's a real problem. The other problem, which I think is extremely important, is the budget process is very decentralized, which usually economists like, right? But when it comes to government, and especially the budget process, it's not necessarily a good idea. So you have a scarce resources, which is taxpayers' dollars, right? But you have all these committees that are completely independent and decentralized that actually go and decide independently of each other how much they're going to pay, how much they're going to spend, how much of that common pool of resources they're going to be spending, right? With no real constraint on how much they need to spend and how much the other committees. This is what economists call the tragedy of the common. Just think about it this way. It's like I give my credit card, right, to my daughters before school starts, and I tell them both, just go and buy what you need for school. They'll be excited, I'm sure. And probably they won't be going together, and they will think that they can spend whatever they want because their needs are the most important, and they will rack up that credit card, right, without giving a thought about whether the other one is doing the same thing and thinking about what's going to be left for me to spend, right? This is a tragedy of the common. It's a real problem that we have. But the third problem, which is a real problem too, again, is this odd accounting rule that guides a lot of not only the communication but also the scoring, right? In the scoring of our budget process, and it's called the current policy baseline budgeting, right? It is a budgeting process that assumes that even a reduction in the growth of spending amounts to a spending cut. Right? So let's go back to my daughter, right? Imagine if told her, you're going to get a 10% increase annually in your allowance, right? So she gets in her head, gets in her room and use her new math skills to calculate how much she will be making in 10 years, right? Turns out my daughter is whatever you want to think, like maybe she's a brat, or times are difficult and I just don't have enough money and I have to tell her, sweetie, I'm really sorry. Or if she's a brat, I'll be not saying there won't be any sweetie coming from me, but I'll say, I'm not going to be giving you a 10% increase, I'm going to be giving you a 9% increase. I can hear it right now. I mean, and she will be like screaming bloody murder that, what, you're cutting my allowance, and if in effect, comparing to what she'd imagined I was going to do, this represents a cut. However, as you can see on this chart, it's really not a cut. A cut is like you start with 10 and the next year you get 9. It's not you start with 10 and the next year you get, $10.90. Right? Well, this is what happened, however. This is what happened all the time in Washington. Because of this current policy baseline budgeting, lawmakers in Washington have actually are used to calling just a simple reduction in the growth of spending a cut. This is how you get headlines, for instance. I'm using the Paul Ryan's roadmap, but I mean, this applies to the Deficit Commission plan. You hear headlines about how his roadmap is going to gut out $4 trillion out of the federal budget, when in fact, when you look at the projection of spending under his budget plan, spending is going up quite dramatically. And if you remember, it was the same thing with the Deficit Commission. This plan was going to cut $4 trillion when in fact, you were going to get a $1.6 trillion increase in 10 years. So that's a real problem, which we need to address. A cut is a cut, right? If spending goes up, it's not a cut. The fourth problem is that the budget is so complex that, as I said, the winners are the one who actually can navigate it and exploit their loopholes, whether it's lawmakers or whether it's actually interest groups. And again, this is actually a real problem, because all of us who are not constantly looking at these little loopholes, we are the big losers, definitely. And we can't have a system that actually relies on expert in breaking the rules or actually exploiting loopholes to actually dictate how much money is spent. So why are we in this situation, and why is it so hard to reform? I mean, there is so much talk all of the time about how we need to reform the budget process. And as you can see on this chart, there actually has been, a lot of plans to do it. So, and as you can also see on this chart, is actually not just worked that well. When you look at the red line is government spending as a percentage of GDP, and those, they're not bubbles, but squares, represent the last 5 attempts to reform the budget. Well, my theory and I'm sticking to it, is that in order for a budget process reform to be effective, you have to actually have a consensus, or more importantly, budget process reforms are usually the reflection of whatever consensus Washington has been able to gather. So take the 1977 Act, right? The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. What this reform was about, it was a consensus about the fact that we need to have a process, actually. And it said, what it did said is like timelines about when things needed to happen and how, right? But it didn't actually address anything that had to do with deficit. Back then, there were no consensus about addressing deficit, controlling spending, right? In the 80s, you have the Graham-Rodman-Halling, which actually is the expression of a consensus in Washington that something needs to be done about controlling deficits. Deficits are seen as rampant and like devastating. I wish we were in the 80s almost now. But at the time, they were seen as this great danger that we were, and deficits are bad, granted. So there was this consensus in Washington that something needed to be done, but there wasn't a consensus in Washington about how to do it. So the rules that actually Congress came up with reflected that consensus that we needed to, but then it excluded Social Security, it excluded defense spending, and so it actually really did not work. Interestingly, the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, what that expressed is that there was a consensus about the fact that the Graham-Rodman-Halling budget reform had failed and that we needed ways to enforce it. But again, you don't really get, so the budget rules reflect the consensus of the time. But again, no consensus about how to do it. And, it set some PAYGO rule, but they were just not working because they were only addressing new spending and things like this. And then at the end of the 90s, you have the Balanced Budget Act, and this time the focus is on balancing the budget rather than addressing deficit. There are scholars that I've been reading recently that actually say that we don't really actually need budget rules. I mean, I don't agree with this, that we don't need, because very often, they're just, as I said, the reflection of these consensus. And then as such, they're just, even if we didn't have it, things would happen because that's where Congress wants to go. I'm not sure I would go that far. That being said, I actually think the real problem is that we only get as good a budget process in the books as Congress is actually willing to compromise. Basically, they draft those rules, right, in a way that is not going to constrain them that much, unless they actually finally decide, and they may do that at some point, one day, when I'm alive, hopefully, they may decide that it is time to actually get serious about it, right? And the real problem, again, with the budget reforms is like each time you want to put in rules on the books about constraining the power of spending of the government, what you do is you're stepping on the toes of lawmakers' ability to actually fund their pet projects, buy votes, and assert their power. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work so well. I think at the congressional level, from what I've said, some important reforms are needed. And then this is more like kind of a principle-based approach of statutory rules that I think, kind of encapsulate all the problems that I've seen and that I've talked about. The first one is we actually need to have very strict and binding rules, and I'm using David Primo's, expression, I guess. We need some rules that bite, and we need some strict credible budget caps. Of course, you need to actually allow for some flexibility, but not so much flexibility as the flexibility we have through the emergency spending system, right? The other very important budget rule that I think, or the characteristic of a budget rule that we would need, is we need to put all the spending on the table. No budget process will ever control spending, ever, if big chunks of the budget are excluded from the process. It just won't work, right? The other part, which I think is like one of the most important and difficult part to actually put in place, is the enforcement part. We need to make the enforcement part and to basically restrict the ability of Congress, first, to let rules expire, and second, to actually increase spending. So for instance, I think having a supermajority to vote on any increase of spending would, achieve this. That being said, and I'm gonna end up in a second, is like, that being said, while I would be cheering if these rules were finally put on the books, I am under no illusion that this will remain the law of the land in Washington, D.C., unless we find a way to address the long term. History has shown that Congress is very often happy to totally ignore the rules that are on the books. More importantly, what we've seen is that Congress is perfectly happy to let these rules expire or to change them. And this is why I think that unless there is a way to tie Congress's hands to guarantee that rules, if we have good rules on the books, are not changed, we will achieve way more. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeRugy. It's almost as if we had planned this. It's a perfect transition to our second speaker, Dr. David Primo. Dr. Primo is an associate professor of political science and business administration at Rochester University, and his current research focuses on budget rules, the value of legislative pork for re-elections, the politics of judicial appointments, and the effectiveness of campaign finance laws. He's published articles in multiple journals, most notably the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization. Dr. Primo has been quoted and written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg News, and numerous other media outlets on the topics of government spending and policy, and he's testified before Congress on the subject of constitutional balanced budget rules. His campaign finance research was cited by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 2011 case addressing public funding for elections. And Dr. Primo has written 3 books, including the one that you find on the table in front of you today, Rules and Restraint Government Spending and the Design of Institutions. Dr. Primo teaches courses in American politics, business and public policy, entrepreneurship, and positive political theory. And he is the recipient of 2 impressive awards at the University of Rochester for his teaching ability. In fact, in 2005, the undergraduates voted him Professor of the Year. So without further ado, to tell us about rules that work and rules that bite, Dr. David Primo.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jim, and thank you all for coming today, taking time out of your schedules to hear about what I think is really a fundamental topic right now in American politics, and that's how are we going to fix the budget process? Whenever I tell people I study budget rules, eyes glaze over, right? Who cares about rules? Process isn't exciting. Fortunately, in this group, I think there might be a slightly different perception that rules do matter and rules can matter and process is important. And you can start any talk on the importance of budget rules with a figure, right? Showing massive projected increase in federal spending. I could have put a figure here. I didn't. I knew Vera was going to have a figure earlier in her talk, so I said that figure will work. Right? You see this massive explosion in federal spending coming in the next 10 or 20 years. We could hit 90% of a debt to GDP ratio of 90% by 2020. That's an astonishing number. Is it so high that the U.S. That creditors will lose faith in U.S. debt? Honestly, the answer from an economist should be, I don't know. There is some research out there showing that 90% debt to GDP ratio is pretty dangerous. But the fact is the United States is somewhat unique in being essentially the reserve currency. The dollar is the reserve currency for the world. So we might be able to get away with it for a longer period of time than other countries. There's a reason why Greece is in default or potentially in default on their debt, and we're not in any danger right now of defaulting on our debt. Countries are different. The U.S. is in a unique place. But the fact is, because we don't know what that magic number is where debt gets so high that China decides doesn't want to buy our debt anymore, or there's some fundamental restructuring of the U.S. economy as a result of the massive debt we've taken on. Because we don't know where that magic point is, we don't want to get there. Right? We want to deal with the budget problems early, because the earlier we deal with them, right, the better off we'll be, and we can avoid finding out exactly what that magic number is for the United States. So obviously entitlements are a big part of the problem here. Baby boomer generations retiring, that's going to lead to really a lot of cost pressures on Social Security and Medicare. That's a big part of our budget problem. And that is going to produce unsustainable debt levels. Again, we don't know what those levels are, but I would argue we don't want to find out what those are. So what I want to do today is talk about what we can do now to head off a fiscal crisis. And I'm going to talk about two kinds of changes. One is statutory. One set of changes is statutory. What can we do to laws right now to affect change? And the second is sort of a more longer-term change, and that's constitutional changes. What can we do to the U.S. Constitution to ensure that we can get on a fiscal track that's sustainable and stay there? And that's what I'd like to talk about today. All right, so what's needed to get spending under control? I would argue there are two pieces to the puzzle. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of steps, but as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, we could go in the reverse order as well. So you could start with programmatic changes. Okay? The fact is that, again, as I mentioned, entitlements are really what's going to drive the increase in costs for the federal government in the next 10, 20 years, really for the foreseeable future. So what you need to do is have an actual fundamental restructuring of entitlement programs. Here's what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean saying we're going to increase the eligibility age for Medicare by 2 years. I remember the debate in Washington a few months back. Everybody was shocked that the Republicans didn't accept this proposal that Obama had at one point put on the table. And that sounds bold, maybe, but really it's not, because it doesn't change the underlying incentives of the program. It doesn't change the incentives of patients. It doesn't change the incentives of doctors. It's not going to do anything to change how people consume healthcare, and so it's not going to solve the problem. Yes, it'll take 2 years of individuals off of the books of Medicare, and that'll help a little bit, but it doesn't change the day-to-day interaction between doctors and patients, and really that's the nature of the problem with Medicare and with all of healthcare. So Paul Krugman said, we don't have a Medicare problem, we have a healthcare cost problem. He's half right. We have a healthcare cost problem, but we also have a Medicare problem to the extent that the federal government pays for over 40% now of healthcare costs in the country. If there's a healthcare cost problem, there's a Medicare problem, there's a spending problem. So we need a fundamental restructuring of entitlements. And at the same time, we need a review of discretionary spending programs. Now, as Vero's figure that she put up a few minutes ago shows, discretionary spending really isn't a huge part of the federal budget, and it's not projected to increase at such a dramatic rate relative to entitlements. So why do we need to deal with it? I would argue that symbolically it's important to deal with those programs, because if you're going to ask people to accept major changes to entitlements, major changes to Medicare, major changes to Social Security, you can't say at the same time, but the Department of Education, we can't touch that, it's too important. The Department of Commerce, that's too important, we can't touch that. That's not going to resonate well. So you need to have a fundamental review of all programs in the federal budget, not just entitlements, because that's a way to show that this is a reform effort that's not just singling out people who consume healthcare as they get older. Right? So I think symbolically it's important to tackle discretionary spending as well. So once we've sort of done that, why do we need budget rules? So we can get reforms to Medicare, let's say, somehow, miraculously, right? There's an agreement. This is how we're going to fix healthcare. Why do you need budget rules then? It doesn't. If going back to Vero's point, if we have consensus on what Medicare spending changes should look like, why do we need budget rules? Well, I would argue we need budget rules in order to lock in any of the changes that are made programmatically. There are two reasons for this. One, it's a backstop against the temptation to create new government programs down the road. So we fix Medicare, right? So we reduce the projected increases in Medicare growth. Well, what happens in 5 years if Congress decides it wants to create a new entitlement program that could lead essentially to just as much government spending down the road? It was the Republicans, after all, who proposed the last major expansion of the Medicare program, not the Democrats. So this is a bipartisan concern. Second, we want to prevent backsliding in any existing reforms that we've managed to put into place. And the way to do that is to put into place rules that actually place limits on overall spending, because that's going to prevent a temptation to undo any existing changes or to add new spending programs. Now, I mentioned here, we want to have these limits have no loopholes. Why would I take the time to single out no loopholes? Well, as Vero, I think, very clearly showed, loopholes are what render rules meaningless, and members of Congress and their staffs are really good at finding loopholes. Right? This is what a good member of Congress does if they want to get around a rule. You find a way to declare some kind of spending you want to get into the budget as an emergency. There are never as many emergencies as when Congress wants to spend money. Then we got a lot of emergencies on our hands, and that's simply untenable. Because it's going to make a mockery of existing rules. Now, I would argue that we could move in the reverse direction here. We could start with budget rules to sort of create a framework for change. So you could start with a budget rule that says we're going to cap spending at a certain amount of GDP in every fiscal year, and then have reforms move to entitlements and to other spending programs move us toward that goal. And certainly that's one route. But as I'm going to talk about, because budget rules are very hard to enforce, unless there's an existing consensus on what those changes are going to look like, that approach may not work. And that's one reason I've advocated constitutional budget rules, because those rules actually do bind Congress in ways that statutory rules just aren't going to do. So that's sort of just laying the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about now, which is what these rules ought to look like. Right. So what do these rules need to look like? Well, the reason we need budget rules and why the design is going to be so important is that members of Congress face what I call a time consistency problem. Okay? And the design of rules, how we set them up, is really crucial for dealing with this time consistency problem. Simply put, a pledge made today is going to be hard to keep tomorrow. And that's for two reasons. One is human nature, and two is the fact that members of Congress aren't elected to life terms. Right? So the first problem is human nature. I can say today that I'm going to do something tomorrow, but when tomorrow comes, I still have to have an incentive to take that action. Right? I can say I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and exercise, right? But if I wake up tomorrow morning and say I don't feel like it, well, I don't have to. So rules are a way to constrain your future self in some way, or in this sense, Congress today wants to constrain itself tomorrow. Right? And it's going to be difficult for members of Congress to abide by their pledges tomorrow, especially if those pledges are for difficult choices. So one question we could pose: do you really think that Congress is going to let the trigger be pulled if the supercommittee doesn't do its job? Do you think they're going to let $1.2 trillion $1.2 trillion in cuts go through? I'm very skeptical that Congress will let that trigger be pulled. Very skeptical. Another great example of this, of a trigger not being pulled in some sense, is the Medicare doc fix. 1997 Balanced Budget Act that Vero referred to. One feature of it was that we were going to place the sort of doc fix into Medicare that was going to place limits on reimbursements to physicians if Medicare spending increased at too great a rate. And the claim was, look, we're going to put this on autopilot. It's going to go into effect automatically. And Peter Orszag last week had an op-ed saying we need to make things more automatic. Well, it doesn't always work out that way. Members of Congress, if they want spending to go through or fear some bad consequences, are going to be perfectly willing to undo what they've done. And every year, we sort of said, oh, you know what, we're not going to implement this doc fix. Physicians wouldn't take Medicare patients anymore. We can't do this. And so the doc fix has sort of gone out the window. And that's the same thing we could imagine happening with many budget rules that are statutory, especially because Congress can always undo them. And so there has to be some consistent time consistency to the pledges. They have to be credible for the future. Second reason we need rules is it's a way to hold members' feet to the fire. It's especially useful when constitutional rules are not an option, which I'll talk about in a moment why those may not be an option. A rule is a very public statement of Congress's commitment to a certain level of spending or to a certain set of reforms. Now, if they violate their own pledges because they want to, quote, save Medicare, so the claim with the doc fix was if we don't implement the doc fix, doctors will no longer take Medicare patients. Okay, members of the public probably aren't going to say, well, but you broke your rule. That's a bad thing you've done. Right? But if we have the markets involved and we're talking about the overall size of federal spending, then that speaks to the credibility of the U.S. government. And so to the extent that you can somehow tie these rules to market-based incentives or the credit rating of the United States, you might actually have some sort of possibility of getting public commitment to fiscal discipline from members of Congress that you might not otherwise get. And so I would argue that if you can't get constitutional rules, the second best option is to have some sort of rule that has an external enforcement mechanism that is tied to public perceptions, whether it's public opinion or the markets or rating agencies. I can imagine we'll get statutes that are passed that are going to define revenues and outlays in very creative ways, the goal being to get around any particular budget rule. So it'd be very important at a minimum to define revenues and outlays very carefully. And I would argue we need very large supermajorities to waive the rule. We don't want to make it too easy to waive the rule because otherwise it will just become like any other piece of legislation, and we don't want to have that. And finally, through enforcement, or in terms of enforcement, we'll get external forces here at play. We'll get the Supreme Court, and we'll get the weight of the Constitution, in some sense, acting as an enforcement mechanism. And I think that's a very important thing. And as I mentioned earlier, right, if these rules were violated, the Supreme Court would step in, and members of Congress don't want that. And that, if anything, is going to be the most important enforcement mechanism in a constitutional budget rule. Now, I'm a realist. I don't think a constitutional budget rule will probably pass this year. Doesn't seem very likely. We'll vote on it, but I don't think it's going to pass at this point. What can we do in the interim? Well, the key here is we need to have rules or reforms that are credible in the long run. Okay? So if we can't have constitutional rules, what can we have? Well, we could have what I call sticky reforms to entitlement programs. Reforms that are going to be hard to change once they're put into place. What do reforms like that look like? Well, they're reforms that create gridlock. And I think gridlock can be a great thing if the gridlock is for a status quo policy you think is a good one. So if you create a new set of winners and losers as you reform entitlements, well, then it's going to be very difficult to undo those reforms. The problem with, let's say, the Medicare doc fix was that it just created a set of losers, essentially. Doctors would get less money. Patients were worried they wouldn't get seen. Well, that's a pretty powerful coalition. Right? You need to create entitlement program reforms that are actually going to create a new set of winners and losers. They're going to make further changes to the program very difficult. Second, we need to get the public involved more. The public is concerned about the deficit, but there's a disconnect between concerns about the deficit and an understanding of the fact that deficits are due to spending. Right? So you do public opinion polls, everybody thinks we need to cut the deficit, but we can't cut Medicare, we can't cut Social Security, we can't cut education, we can't cut anything, but we need to reduce the deficit. There needs to be education of members of the public about that link. And related to that, the markets have to start sending stronger signals to the Congress about this. I think the S&P downgrade of U.S. debt was a very positive thing in one regard, is it made the U.S. Congress, made the president aware that there potentially are dire consequences from failing to get the budget under control. The S&P downgrade isn't going to have any practical effect in the short run. But if more rating agencies downgrade our debt, or if China decides they don't want to buy as much debt as they have in the past, that's going to start sending really strong signals. And that could be a way to have enforcement and that's not through the Constitution. Okay. So what challenges are there here as I wrap up to actually implementing even that set of second best reforms? Well, the first challenge is that risks are what I call creeping. This is not a term I created, but it's a term in economics. A creeping risk is a risk that doesn't manifest itself all at once. It builds gradually, and then you have a collapse. So you could imagine a wire that's got a lot of tension on it. It's fine for 20 years, and all of a sudden it snaps one day. That's the problem we face with the U.S. debt. Unfortunately, because we don't know when it's going to snap, members of Congress can say, well, we can wait until next year to deal with this. We can wait until next year to deal with this. And they're right until the wire snaps. And so that's one challenge to getting members to take seriously the idea that we need to do something about spending today. Second, the reforms have to be bipartisan for a couple of reasons. One is just basic numbers. You can't do much in Washington given the slim majorities right now without both parties. And second, once you've got the buy-in of both parties, it makes it very difficult to undo those reforms. Easy for me to say as an academic, oh yeah, you just have to get bipartisan support for a piece of legislation. Right? Not very easy to do these days in Washington, and I think that's why this is under the challenge slide. One reason it's not very easy to do, of course, is that there are very different visions about what the role of the federal government ought to be. And lastly, future Congresses are very hard to control. Another principle, besides the fact that each House shall determine the rules of its proceedings, is that Congress today cannot bind Congress tomorrow. Congress today cannot tell Congress tomorrow what to do. And because of that, you have a problem with the consistency of rules over time. So I think there are a lot of challenges here, but I also think there are a lot of opportunities. And with people like Paul Ryan in the House right now actually willing to sort of challenge the conventional wisdom on budgets, I think there's a real opportunity here to actually get these ideas out into the public domain in ways that we haven't been able to do so in the past. So thanks very much. I think Jim is going to moderate questions, but if afterwards you have any questions or wanted to talk, my email address and my phone number is there. I'd be happy to talk with anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Primo. Now is the part of the program that I always enjoy most. When you fill the room with your brilliance, you ask good questions of the speakers. I hope they're going to be good, tough questions and really keep them on their toes. But I'm going to preempt you just a little bit and exercise my option to ask the first question as the moderator. And I'd like to ask of Dr. Primo, I know you are sort of an advocate of balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, and the states have those, and I know you've looked at those. And in the states, what we've seen often happen is the judiciary ends up getting involved, and the Supreme Court of the state then turns to the legislature and says, you're in violation of the Constitution, and you have to spend money this way or that way, and it sort of usurps the legislative power. How can the Congress of the United States avoid that?
I think that's a very legitimate concern, and I think the state's experience is one reason why the many in the federal government have paused about a constitutional rule. I think there is a key difference between the states and the federal government, and that is the states have constitutions that are much more complicated, comparatively speaking, than the federal government does. There are often mandates in state constitutions that all children are entitled to education. Now, you may say, oh, that's unobjectionable, but what happens when the state fails to pass a budget and so school funding is jeopardized? Well, many times the courts will step in and sort of impose some sort of mandate on the state legislatures regarding education, saying, well, this is in the Constitution, and we think that's more important than the balanced budget rule that's in the Constitution, let's say. The federal government, there just aren't those kinds of conflicts. So I think the courts would be loath to get involved in the budget process unless absolutely necessary. And even then, I can't imagine the Supreme Court going line by line in the federal budget. I think any decision they did issue with respect to the budget would be much broader and would just speak to overall levels of spending or budget balance, whatever the rule requires. And that's, in some sense, why it's important to just focus on total spending and not get into details about types of spending or anything like that, because that's just going to make it so complex. And the more complex it is, the more room there is for court involvement.
David, I've seen a lot of spending caps crafted in different ways. Some tie it to GDP growth, others potential GDP, some to inflation plus population growth. Based on your research, is there one way that's stronger than another to craft a spending cap?
I think that all of the approaches get at the important issue, which is limiting the growth of spending. And I think in many respects, those details depend on the goals that you have. For instance, one concern with saying we're going to tie federal spending to GDP growth is to say, why, because the economy gets better, does it imply that we need to spend more money at the federal level? So there are some who would argue that it makes more sense to say there should be some fixed level of government spending and then increase spending based on GDP, saying that we're going to have more expenses as spending growth go up. Other people would say we just need to tie it to population, because as population goes up, government probably ought to spend more. And also tying it to inflation, that's a concern for some people because they believe that that's just going to create incentives for central banks or for others to try to encourage inflation, because that allows you to spend more money. So I don't think there's any perfect way to craft that limit. And I think GDP is a reasonable place to start, pegged to, and including inflation and population growth, I think is reasonable. But you might want to put a cap on that inflation. So, if inflation goes to 20%, I don't think we should justify that proportional increase in government spending. So you want to limit the ability to game the system in some sense.
So actually, I have a question on this, which is how do we get the lawmakers or whomever is going to be crafting this, constitutional amendment to come up with basically the golden rules that you've laid out? I mean, how do we get to that point? Because I actually think you talked about the objection or the fear of a balanced budget amendment, a constitutional balanced amendment, and I think it actually often boils down to what if the constitutional amendment we get is actually just a bad one. Mm-hmm. So how do we kind of are there ways to alleviate that fear?
I think it's a very real fear. In Rules and Restraint, I argued that it's worthwhile considering a constitutional convention where the states would take the lead in drafting this amendment, because of my concern that otherwise, if members wrote this, they would write in a number of loopholes and exemptions for themselves. And so I think it is a very real fear. I'm not sure there's any way to solve it, although I would say that it's better not to implement a constitutional balanced budget rule or a constitutional spending limit, period, than it is to put into place a bad one, or one that has so many loopholes that it's going to be rendered meaningless, because that makes a mockery of the Constitution, and it's very hard to change, and then members will have no incentive to be fiscally responsible in the future in some sense, because they can say, look, we're living by this rule, even as they've written it so that it's essentially ineffectual.
I believe the lady down front here has a question.
Thanks so much for your talks. Lisa Garcia from Judicial Watch. My concern was the elimination or the sort of omission of the public checks and balances feature of our constitutional design or our federalist design. The Constitution being the most permanent, the SCOTUS being less permanent, for life, but less permanent, chief executive a little more transient, and then the Congress the most responsive to the public. So to the extent that we would make any permanent changes that would bind future Congresses forever to solvency, as much as I like solvency, we should be able to be more responsive. I mean, the public is that incentive, isn't it? They lose their office. That's sort of the incentive to agree and pass a budget. To the extent that we eliminate any exceptions to the budget so that we put everything back on the table. I don't know, do you thought about that, or how would you address that?
I mean, I wish they lost their offices, but I think the data show that they don't, certainly enough. I mean, so that's pretty much the only thing I would say. I mean, I think, again, a real problem we have now is there isn't any place right now and the entire process that we have that actually addresses the question of how big our government is and should be. And one of the things that is actually also very problematic is the ability of a Congress today, with the support or not of the electorate, to actually impose gigantic costs on future generations. And I actually think that is actually a even bigger problem than the one that you raised.
One thing I would just say to that is that I understand completely the idea that we want to make sure that there's responsiveness to the public via the legislative branch. But on the other hand, I think that there are fundamental challenges with representative government with respect to the budget, collective action problems. Vero talked about the tragedy of the Commons earlier, that causes this problem. So if I'm a member of Congress and I go to my district and I say, well, I've managed to get the deficit under control, but I've taken away all of these programs to do it, I'm probably not going to get reelected. But if I go and I say I saved all of these programs and the deficit went up, well, I can blame the deficit on everybody else's spending. And so I think what the balanced budget rule does, or what a spending limit does, is constrains the size of the federal government and then allows members to make decisions about where that spending ought to go. And that's where what I think is more properly the legislative function. Just as we have other provisions in the Constitution that we don't want to let be subject to the whims of Congress year in and year out, I think total size of the federal budget ought to be one of those. But certainly there are people who vigorously disagree with that perspective.
Gentleman there on the back row. Yeah, you mentioned a hesitancy for allowing exemptions. Is there a place for any exemptions? And if so, what would be allowable?
I mean, certainly in the budget process, I think there should be some flexibility for emergencies, for instance. I mean, there are things that are truly unforeseeable, but the rules should be set in a way that emergency is actually defined properly, where emergency is actually a true emergency, unlike what we've seen in the last 10 years. And it's happened before, but the last 10 years, I think, are, a really vibrant example of the abuse of the system, where, historically, for instance, war funding went through the emergency process, especially the first year, but then within 2-3 years, actually the funding was entirely going through the regular budget process, the regular budget, and we haven't seen this in the last 10 years. So they should be certainly ways to allow the system to be flexible. But as long as it's, properly, these emergencies are properly defined, not abused. And I think I would also say that there is really something to be said about the lack of exceptions. Whether it's our budget or whether it's our tax code, it is absolutely, filled with exception constantly. If you take the tax system, right, you don't pay, the amount of taxes you pay are almost nothing to do with how much you make. It depends on whether you have children or not, whether you own a house or you rent, which kind of state tax rates you pay, and this is actually really problematic to actually allow this type of exemption, and it's the same for spending. So.
So my question is, it seems like there's probably some trade-off between the stringency of the rule and the ability of getting the rule in place, right? And so I was just down at, or maybe it was up, at another event where senators and representatives were debating what should the balanced budget amendment, what characteristics should it have. And there were some folks there who said, don't even think about proposing one that doesn't also have a spending limit. And my thought is that if you include a spending limit, that's going to make sure that it's not going to get passed. And one of the beauties of a balanced budget amendment is that doesn't it sort of naturally limit spending by making it so that you can't impose the costs of spending onto the next generation? So how do you view that trade-off? Is it necessary to try to include a spending limit in a balanced budget amendment, or should you just go for a balanced budget amendment since it's more likely to pass?
I think the balanced budget amendments are without spending caps are indirect ways to limit spending, because you're essentially getting that reduction in spending through the mechanism that members of Congress can only raise taxes so much before they get pushed back. But so that's a very indirect way of limiting spending, and there's lots of potentially unintended consequences there that could emerge. On the other hand, as long as there's some flexibility built into the balanced budget rule that allows for emergency, so in times of war or some major potential depression where you might want the government to step in, a balanced budget rule would be a way to get reduced spending in a more palatable way to some members. So I think that if you can get a balanced budget rule in place, it's as long as there are reasonable exceptions made for true emergencies, and you have to define that really, really well, I think it's better than no rule at all. But I think if you get actual spending limits in there, I think that's even better. Although one has to wonder if members who don't want spending capped would be willing to vote for a balanced budget amendment without a spending cap. What does that suggest about their beliefs about the likelihood of that amendment actually capping spending? Just something to think about.
The other part of of this answer is to follow on what does it say. I mean, I can see some lawmakers who are against spending caps and in favor of balanced budget amendment because they actually think that you can actually balance the budget at let's say 80% of GDP, right? Of course, the reality is different. While you can spend 80% of GDP, you can't necessarily raise taxes to balance that budget. But this is an example of this, maybe an instances where I can see lawmakers saying, oh yeah, well, we won't vote for the spending cap, but we'll do the balanced budget amendment because, come on, if we get even 50%,
Lady from the far corner there.
Have there been any efforts put in place to make the definition of emergency spending a little stricter?
No. No credible ones. In fact, one of the things that I find really the most distressing is there's been this issue over emergency spending is not a new one. It's been a concern for years. And one of the things that President Reagan did actually was, and the Graham Rodman Halling did, was to actually try to address this issue of emergency spending. And one of the things that they did is to impose some offsets. And then there was this whole debate whether, for instance, if you had to use emergency in times of wars, did it mean that the offsets needed to come from, the general budget, or did it need to come from the Department of Defense? And that's an issue that was never really completely settled. But one thing was sure, that they were coming up with offsets, and they had a clearer definition or understanding of emergency at the time. What's been distressing is in 2002, the Republican Congress and President decided to let the last rules that actually kind of controlled somewhat the way the emergency spending process, and that since then, in spite of a lot of lip service from this president about nothing really has happened. And if we look at the last big debate over disaster aids spending, which basically would be labeled emergency, you can tell that one of the things that members there are really two pieces of that question is what is a true emergency, but also whether emergency spending ought to be offset. Right, and you can see that there's really no will, fundamentally, to actually put some rules back in the books about defining emergency, but also truly, coming up with a system to offset the spending. So I hope we will, because as we've seen in the last 10 years, this is potentially a great source, a great way to actually spend a lot of money, right? So I do certainly hope that. And especially, it's even more important because we need a venue to address emergency. I mean, it's inconceivable not to have this flexibility in the system, but it needs to be designed in a way that doesn't lead to the abuse that we've seen.
Anything to add, Dr. Primo? Further questions for the panel? I do have a further question for the panel. Dr. Primo, the states have balanced budget amendments, but as we know, many of them, if not most of them, are deeply in debt. They have a balanced budget amendment, but they have a working budget and then a capital budget or something else. What is to say that the Congress of the United States wouldn't find itself in exactly the same position?
Very good question. I mean, I think this sort of points to the importance of careful rule design. The balanced budget rules in the states, the constitutional rules typically are fairly vague and create lots of opportunities for legislatures to be creative, and legislatures will be creative. And I think this is the risk with allowing a constitutional amendment to say that Congress shall write the enacting legislation, because Congress is going to write it to get the outcomes they want, and if there isn't the will there to cut spending, you won't see it cut. So I think that speaks to why it's very important to design these rules carefully, because the states have developed an enormous sort of set of policies to get around the balanced budget requirement. That said, I think it's important to keep in mind that states, relatively speaking, are models of fiscal responsibility compared with the federal government. Yes, they take on debt. Yes, they don't necessarily balance their budgets perfectly in any given year due to some fiscal chicanery, but by and large, they're pretty darn close in any given year to balance relative to the federal government. So we have a federal balanced budget amendment would have an enormous impact in the United States federal government if the lessons of the states are any experience.
Any last questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm John Samples at Cato Institute. I came late, so forgive me if this has already been questioned. I mean, in the other, the Republican Study Committee event, there was a mention about how to get it actually passed through Congress. And one of the indications was, I mean, first Senator Rand Paul said you start with the strongest possible. You don't go looking for votes initially. And then Grover Norquist said something around trying to somehow attract groups of people. So the idea being you don't go around looking for the marginal 65th vote or whatever in the Senate that you need. And it does seem like looking for that final marginal vote, which is going to be somewhere in a polarized environment, that last vote to get an amendment out of Congress, a balanced budget amendment out of Congress, is going to water down or destroy the amendment. So I wonder what your thoughts on that are. And second, that suggests, if that's not possible, that there's the other alternative, which is a constitutional convention, which is being discussed more widely these days. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that possibility.
I agree completely about the concern about getting enough votes to get it through. And in a Mercatus working paper, I don't think was distributed here, but is available online, called Making Budget Rules Work, I talk, one of the principles I have for budget rule design is beware compromise. Compromise is not always a good thing, especially when it comes to constitutional rules. As I mentioned earlier, sort of better to have no rule than a bad rule. And I think that is why I'm not optimistic that we'll see serious constitutional budget reform this year, because I just don't think the votes are there. And to get the votes, you'd have to make the rules so watered down that it would be better to wait until the timing was better. The Constitutional Convention route, I mean, when I wrote about this in Rules and Restraint a few years back, many of my colleagues thought I was a little bit nuts. But there's more talk now about whether Constitutional Convention on the budget and on other items makes sense. And the states have an incentive for the federal government to get this right, because the states sort of benefit from a more fiscally responsible federal government. On the one hand, on the other hand, the states may also be looking out for themselves and worry about less aid coming their way. But at the very least, the states aren't going to be as likely to design these rules with loopholes as members of Congress will be. So that's not a perfect process either. But I think it's slightly better than letting Congress do it. Fortunately, I would hope that those who advocate strongly for a balanced budget rule or a spending limit at the constitutional level within Congress would pull the plug before they let a bad one go through. I know there's a temptation in Washington to focus on the art of the possible. What can we get done? But I think hopefully among some members of Congress there'd be a willingness to say, let's not get this done if we're not going to do it right.
I mean, I guess I'll say like maybe the silver lining is like just looking at the previous balanced budget reforms that we've had. as I said, I mean, I can see a situation where actually there is a consensus about the fact that something really drastic needs to happen and that it needs to be done right. And that's when they actually usually go and draft, rules that are good ones. And that could happen if are in such a terrible economic shape that, the incentives are aligned to have this consensus, not only about the fact that something needs to be done, but that something, very comprehensive needs to be done. Whether we'll ever get there is, it's a whole different question. But there's this one possibility, I think, where they will have the incentive, the consensus will exist, and they will do it right.
Is that going to be a crisis? Do you think we have to wait till we get to a crisis before we'll get reform?
Yeah.
That's my fear.
Possible.
I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, it just, otherwise, I mean, why would they want to really tie their hands in a comprehensive manner? I mean, there's just like, there's no doubt, like, look at what's happening right now. There's no doubt that people talk about how we need to get the deficit under control and things like this, but there's really no consensus about how to do it. Like, even like, Republicans are unwilling to actually talk about reforming the autopilot programs, entitlement program. There's no consensus about this, and there's no consensus about when to do it, when to get, our books in order. And so we're not there yet because we're not in bad shape, enough.
And I think on that cheerful note, we will call it a wrap. Thank you so much for being with us, and thanks to our great panel. I hope that you'll join us for the final seminar in this series on October 19th when we will be looking at entitlement reform. We will be joined at that point by the two public trustees for Medicare and Social Security, and we will also have the Honorable Alice Rivlin with us. It will be moderated by our former director of the Social Security Administration, and I think it promises to be quite enlightening. We hope you will join us on October 19th for that event. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.